most of the people that I have taught mindfulness to, either in our research studies or in my clinical practice, have said, I just can't do this. I hate yoga. I have a distractible mind. I have ADHD, whatever. And my response is always, fantastic. You're a perfect candidate for mindfulness then.
Welcome to Sleeping Around, where we offer a peek behind the curtain of modern sex and relationship therapy and research, bringing you insights and conversations otherwise reserved for the therapy room. I'm your host, Alayna Joy, a Master's of Counseling Psychology student, content creator, and lifelong sex and relationship nerd. Enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Sleeping Around. I apologize for my voice right now. I am getting over a cold that has absolutely knocked me out for the past week, but I am here right now to introduce today's episode and guest, Dr. Lori Brotto. Dr. Brotto is a professor in the UBC Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, where she holds a Canada Research Chair in Women's Sexual Health. In this role, she's focused on developing safe, effective, and accessible treatments to address highly prevalent sexual concerns in women. Dr. Brotto is also the Executive Director for the Women's Health Research Institute, one of only 3 institutes in Canada devoted to advancing research in women's health. In this role, she supports nearly 500 members across the province to collectively advance our knowledge in all domains of women's health. So Dr. Brotto and I share a similar goal in spreading awareness and information around sexuality and sexual health. I do want to note that in this episode, a lot of binary cisnormative language is used. So when you hear men or males, know that we're talking about cis men. And when you hear women or females, we're talking about cisgender women. Unfortunately, the scientific community and most research has not caught up in terms of gendered language. I am seeing this change slowly in small pockets of research, and I hope that that continues. But for today's episode, we are talking all about mindfulness and sex. How can mindfulness unlock our sexualities? We talk about mindfulness and sensory sensitivities. We talk about low sexual desire. We talk about whether or not your partner or partners have to be on board and engaging in mindfulness with you in order for this to be effective. It is a practical and engaging conversation, and I hope that you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed having it. Enjoy the episode. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey to start off into the field of sexual health? What inspired you to focus on this area?
So I was a UBC undergraduate student many years ago, and I was very interested in gaining some experience with research, and knew that I had to start volunteering in a research lab at some point if that was the career that I was going to pursue. And I happened to be accepted by a researcher in the Department of Psychology who was studying animal models of sexual dysfunction. So essentially what that entailed is administering stressful environments, giving antidepressant medications, and then really studying the changes to sexual behavior among rats. And I learned quite a bit about kind of the pharmacology and physiology of sexual activity and behavior in animals, and it was fascinating. It also really introduced me to kind of the scientific method and how do you go about designing a study to allow you to explore this really fascinating aspect of function, sexual behavior. But I was also a bit dissatisfied in that my real interest was in kind of the human experience. And around that same time, so this was nearing the end of my master's, the start of my PhD, was the year that there was a lot of public attention, media attention around sexual behavior in humans. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One was that, number one, Viagra was approved for men, the infamous, effective, safe, discreet, easy to access little blue pill that treated erectile dysfunction in males. And that was kind of the blockbuster of the decade, if not the century, that really put sexual health and sex research on the map in the modern day. And then the second event that happened that same year was a publication that documented how common sexual problems were in the population across genders, across races, across ages. And the study found that about 40% of women experienced sexual problems. And so these two experiences juxtaposed led me to ask the question, well, is there a female Viagra, or is there an effective treatment to address the very common sexual concerns in women? And because a literature review fell short, I essentially found almost nothing on the topic of evidence-based treatments for sexual problems in women. I then left the rat lab and began to do human sexuality research, and have been doing that ever since. So that was 2001, almost 23 years ago now.
The study that you're talking about that found that 40% of women experience some sort of sexual dysfunction or problem or difficulty. Can you talk a little bit more about what some of the common ones were? And then I want to jump into mindfulness specifically and how we can apply it.
The most common sexual difficulty in women is low desire. So this is the person who says, I'm no longer interested in sex. I no longer initiate. I don't respond to a partner's invitations. I don't fantasize. I have no interest in engaging in sexual activity. Not only is it the most common sexual difficulty in women, study after study actually show that to be the most common sexual difficulty in men as well, despite all the attention that erections and, erectile dysfunction and Viagra get. It's actually low desire in men that is also the most common. Slightly less prevalent were pain with sexual activity, difficulties reaching orgasm or having a blunted orgasm intensity, also difficulties with arousal, or just not finding sexual activity pleasurable at all. So no, not necessarily having any problems with the frequency of sex or the intensity of certain experiences, but just overall not finding it satisfying. So that's kind of the range of the different kinds of sexual difficulties that not only do we study in the research setting, but also clinically, because I'm also a registered psychologist, those are also the most common difficulties that walk through my door.
Your book and your research and kind of your expertise is also specifically in the area of mindfulness. So if we bring it back to basics, can we start with what is mindfulness? And then how can we use mindfulness to address, improve, work with some of the difficulties you were talking about?
So mindfulness is really born out of meditation, and I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with meditation. Maybe it conjures up images of a Buddhist monk sitting in lotus pose, row after row, maybe in a cave for many, many hours. And in about the late 1970s, that kind of understanding and practice of meditation was secularized by Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, who was actually a molecular biologist at the time at MIT. But after attending a lecture led by a Master Zen Buddhist individual, he began incorporating meditation into his life. And then it became the focus of his research, and he kind of left his studies and pursued the study of mindfulness. And it was John Kabat-Zinn who, through his secularizing of meditation to mindfulness, defined it very simply as present moment, non-judgmental awareness, in which every thought, every sensation that arises is open to be noticed. And so we understand mindfulness now to be something that is available to anyone, regardless of your religious or non-religious affiliation. It involves a series of practices, often guided, especially if a person is brand new to mindfulness, listening to a guide that walks you through. Now pay attention to the sensations in the belly. Now observe the sensations as you're taking in air. Notice the feelings in the toes, etc. So the invitation in the practice is to repeatedly bring attention to various sensations in the body, moment by moment, and to do so non-judgmentally. That means as you're paying attention, you're not saying to yourself, oh, I'm terrible at this, or where is this getting me? This is a waste of time. Or do I feel better yet? It's rather to observe everything that comes up just as it is. And so since about the late 70s, after John Kabat-Zinn really wrote about mindfulness as potentially a tool that could change the face of many different health-related issues. There has been countless studies that have evaluated mindfulness and found it to be effective for things like chronic pain, anxiety, stress, depression, attention deficit difficulties, and then my interest, of course, is sexual health.
So how do we apply mindfulness as a practice in sexual experience?
This has been work that I started in 2002 when I was a research fellow at the University of Washington, and I was first introduced to mindfulness, not in the context of sex, but in the context of treating borderline personality symptoms. And I actually worked with a group of cancer survivors to help me answer that very question that you just asked, which is, given that mindfulness can be so effective for helping reconnect us with our body and manage judgments and manage intensities of emotions, what does this look like when we apply it to sex? And so, again, together with a group of cancer survivors, we put together a treatment protocol that involved monthly sessions of mindfulness and lots of practice in between. And then we evaluated that, found that it worked. And then since that time, over the past 20 years, we've continued to build on it, evaluate it, adapt it to different environments. So what does it look like essentially? First and foremost, it involves establishing a solid mindfulness practice. This might be signing up for, a regular mindfulness-based stress reduction program, or downloading one of the apps that are readily available through the App Store, or through, even for free, you can find guided meditations on YouTube and other sources. So the foundational work is about how do we learn to focus the attention on the present moment, and how do we learn to manage distractions and kind of let go negative thoughts and judgments. And I call it foundational because if we can learn to do that with general thoughts that come up, with general physiological experiences, we're then much better positioned to take those skills into the sexual encounters, which are arguably more emotional, more fraught with negative judgments, more catastrophizing about how the outcome will go, more worries about what happens if I don't perform, what happens if, my partner's unsatisfied. So in the protocol that I developed, which is also the subject of my second book that came out in 2022, I walk the reader through the protocol itself. So over 8 weeks, about the first 4 sessions is, again, establishing that foundational mindfulness practice. And then we begin to integrate those skills in things like body awareness, self-touch and exploration, guided masturbation, partnered touching, and then ultimately partnered sexual activity. Again, using those same core skills in non-judgmental self-awareness.
It sounds like you're kind of talking about training for anything, right? You wouldn't go run a marathon without doing some 5Ks first. We can't expect ourselves to apply something like mindfulness. This is a skill. To be able to apply it effectively in an arena like sex, like you mentioned, it can be fraught with, it can be emotional, it can be a lot of different sensations happening. To be able to apply a skill into that arena without first practicing it,
right,
maybe is not a realistic expectation. Yeah. And then we risk reinforcing often the negative judgments that people have, which is, I'm not good at this, I'm not competent, I'm not like everyone else, I'm broken. And so we really use normalizing and inviting language. Sorry, my dog. Leo.
I totally understand. Sometimes you can't control the pups, just like you can't control the mind. In fact, I have a slide I often show in my presentations of my dog named Juno, who's a black lab, a very feisty black lab. And I say, the mind is like a curious puppy. It tries to stay put, but it goes everywhere. And it doesn't necessarily go everywhere intentionally or seeking something, but the nature of the mind, just like the nature of puppies, and I think dogs in general, is to be curious and go here and there without restraint. So it's a great analogy, the analogy. And what it helps the person to do is, because we have so much compassion for dogs, right? When the dog barks or the dog pulls you here, you gently tug on the leash and you bring the dog back and you say, you know, come back, Julio, come back to the present. Can we use those same kind of compassionate skills to our mind and say, oh, mind has taken off. Come back, Lori, come back to the present moment. I know that this is the nature of the mind to be pulled here and there. And so that is also part of the skill, is accepting that the mind is curious. It is pulled into a multitude of directions, even when we don't want it to. And mindfulness is a way of teaching us compassion to bring it back to the present moment.
That is such a good image, to imagine the mind like a puppy. And it takes away kind of the judgment and the value that we place on whether or not we're good at, quote unquote, keeping our mind still, right? Like if the mind wanders off somewhere, there's this moral judgment placed on it. Like, I am doing this wrong. I'm bad at this. I'm this, I'm that. Whereas a puppy, they're curious. They're sniffing. There's no good or bad, right or wrong. Yeah.
That's right.
If somebody is interested in starting to practice mindfulness, and let's say they're going to go and download one of the apps or look up a practice online, what kind of things could they expect?
When I start a group with a new group of women or individuals, I love starting with an eating practice. And this is something that John Kabat-Zinn has written a lot about, is the meditation with the raisin. And the reason why an eating meditation is so great is because, number one, we eat every day. And so we have ample opportunities to practice this. Secondly, many of us, if not most of us, can relate to mindless eating. We're eating and we're distracted. We're doing other things. We're not paying attention to the savors and the flavors. Sometimes we eat too much because we're not paying attention. And so the really great thing about starting mindfulness with mindfully paying attention to a raisin, where you first look at it for a while and observe the shape and the size and the colors. You feel the weight of it in your hand. You lift it to the ear and listen, are there any sounds? You hold it to the nostril and then the lips, and then slowly put it in the mouth without chewing, all the while noticing salivation and all the sensations associated with salivation, as well as anticipating eating it. And then very slowly taking a bite of that raisin, one chew, noticing the explosion of flavors, feeling the movement of the jaw, and then very intentionally taking some final bites while the remnants of the raisin fall to the back of the esophagus. So it's a beautiful way to be introduced to mindfulness, because it involves all sensations, because it involves slowing down while eating, which is something that I think a lot of us are grateful for when we have the opportunity to do that. And it beautifully introduces one to the core aspects of mindfulness, which is paying attention non-judgmentally. So when I guide an eating practice like this, I might say something like, if there are memories that come up about raisins, if there are judgments that come up about raisins, either liking them or not liking them, or having a memory of banana bread with raisins in it and being pulled into a memory from 20 years ago, just acknowledge that that has happened and come back to the present moment while drinking in the sensations of the raisin. So when I start a practice like this in my groups that I run mindfulness for women with sexual problems, and then once the meditation is over and I say, what did you observe? What was that like? How can a practice like this be useful for addressing your sexual concerns? It is amazing how consistently the women will say, oh my gosh, if I could pay that much attention to a single raisin, imagine if I used just a fraction of those attention skills while engaging in sexual activity. And so they experience this very first-hand look at the power of mindfulness and its potential role in their own sexual health and sexual experience.
As you were describing the practice of eating the raisin, I'm, parallel applying this to a sexual experience and kind of how those same instructions could be shifted. Is that the then next step of, okay, we've got the foundational practice. I feel like I have a grasp of mindfulness as a skill in day-to-day life. How do you begin to then bring that to something like pleasure or desire?
Definitely, it would be the next step, but not the very next step, because we also want to establish some practice in observing the body. So the body scan is another very common mindfulness practice where one is guided to simply pay attention to sensations in all parts of the body, including parts of the body that we usually don't pay attention to, like the space between the toes, or the earlobe, or the middle part of the back, which is kind of out of reach and is often some place that we don't pay attention to. So the body scan is another great foundational mindfulness practice to build what we call interoception. And interoception is that ability to sense what is happening in the body. And it's so important for people with sexual problems and women with sexual problems, because what the research has shown us is that interoception is actually quite low among those people. So it sort of makes sense. If you're not really acutely tuned in to sensations in the body, you might not appreciate the early signs of arousal or the subtle changes in heart rate and muscle tension that happen as one begins to become aroused or engaged in sexual activity. And you might be more prone to adopt a view which is, you're either fully turned on or you're fully turned off. And so if I don't appreciate those kind of subtle sensations in between, you might be, again, more likely to buy into some of the stereotypes that sex is like an on and off switch. So back to the body scan, another really great practice. And then I always also like to fold in some training around mindfulness of thoughts. And lots of research has shown that people with sexual problems, and women in particular, are very prone to negative or judgmental or dysfunctional beliefs when it comes to sex. So things such as my partner will leave me if I don't respond, or I am broken if I can't have an orgasm, or I am not normal. And these kinds of emotional beliefs can interfere with the sexual response cycle in a way that they can over time become the primary reason why a person has sexual problems. So a mindfulness of thoughts practice involves guiding the person to view those thoughts as just mental events, something the brain does in the same way that the brain can produce thoughts that don't make sense at any other time in your life. The brain can also produce negative sex-related thoughts. And so having some practice in being able to create space between you and those negative thoughts, seeing them as just mental events, maybe seeing them as clouds that go through the sky, is also a really core practice in then applying mindfulness to sexual health and sexual activity.
If somebody then wants to start exploring this with a partner, do you need your partner to be, quote unquote, on board? Is this something that somebody can utilize on their own? Does it need to be an interactive kind of both people engaging with it together, or what would that?
Yeah.
How would that look?
So I wish we had a research study to answer that question, where we, kind of randomize people to mindfulness on their own versus mindfulness with a partner, and then be able to measure some of the things that you're asking about, which is, degree of partner involvement and engagement, the degree to which a partner supports this, believes in it, and how does that affect outcome? We don't have that yet. What we have is kind of our personal experience, my clinical experience, where I do often recommend to the couples that I see in sex therapy that they practice mindfulness together. What I've observed is that to the extent that a partner can be involved, it really supports the main person, if there was a main person, maybe the person who sought out help for their sexual difficulties. It really supports them in kind of sticking with the mindfulness and believing in it. I will often say to couples, You could listen to a body scan in the room and you both practice it independently, but sitting beside each other. And then in my book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness, I wrote about certain couples-focused mindfulness practices like back-to-back sensing, where the two people might be sitting on a chair with their backs touching one another, and they mindfully pay attention to those points of contact, both what they experience in their own body at those points of contact, but also the feeling of their partner's body as well. And then sensate focus, which is a very old sex therapy skill developed by Masters and Johnson in the 1960s that involves progressive touching of the other person while the person receiving the touch just pays attention, is also a wonderful mindfulness practice. Even though Masters and Johnson, when they originally described sensate focus, they never used the word mindfulness. We now understand it to very much be a mindfulness practice. And in fact, there have been rewrites of the original scripts for sensate focus that describe it through the lens of mindfulness, because essentially that's what you're doing. You're paying attention to the touch non-judgmentally. You're receiving it without expectations. You're staying in the moment as soon as you notice the mind going forward and wanting to act on it. So it really is a mindfulness practice. And I think it's an amazing exercise to do with a partner, regardless of whether you have a sexual problem or not. It can be a lot of fun to do even for everyone else, but especially if there are sexual difficulties.
I feel like so much of this could be helpful for any sexual experience, any person, not just somebody who's experiencing some sort of difficulty. It sounds like so much of what you're describing is about slowing down, and the non-judgment piece, right, is like the removing of expectation. It's like the removing of kind of a goal-oriented sexual experience. What would you say to somebody who is listening to this and they're thinking, okay, this all sounds great, but Dr. Brotto, I have a real hard time getting out of my head?
Yeah, I'd say great. You are a perfect candidate for mindfulness. You're normal. Your mind is normal. Your brain is normal. And all you need to practice mindfulness, you already have. You already have an ability to pay attention, and you already have an ability to be compassionate and kind. And it's just a matter of honing those skills through practice. So the more that one is pulled away from the present moment, the more that one is distracted, that means more opportunity to bring it back and therefore cultivate mindfulness in those moments. So mindfulness is not about being fully present, wiping out the world, emptying the mind. That's not about mindfulness. Mindfulness is really in those moments when there's competing demands, there's other things pulling the attention. How quickly and kindly can we notice where the mind has gone and gently bring it back to the present moment? Most of the people that I have taught mindfulness to, either in our research studies or in my clinical practice, have said, I just can't do this. I hate yoga. I have a distractible mind. I have ADHD, whatever. And my response is always, fantastic. You're a perfect candidate for mindfulness then.
Is there anybody that you would say these practices are not for?
In the past, if we go back 10, 15 years, there was a clinical concern around people who have a history of trauma. And if you were to deliver mindfulness in a group format, and what happens if the person dissociates or gets pulled into the story of their trauma in a group environment, could that potentially be dangerous to the person, harmful to the group? So it was actually studied by mindfulness researchers, and we now know that mindfulness is actually a very effective tool for helping people overcome trauma by slowly kind of exposing them to elements of the memories of the trauma while teaching them to be fully present. So we no longer exclude from our research studies people with a history of trauma or PTSD. The one group that I think we still don't know about would be neurodivergent people. So folks who are maybe on the autism spectrum or who have other neurological, neuroatypical divergence, we don't know. And the reason I pose that is because I've actually had a person say to me, I love the kind of premise of mindfulness. It makes a lot of sense, but I'm neuroatypical and my brain has a really, really hard time kind of even being with sensations in the present moment, not in the kind of distractibility sense, but in how that person kind of experiences sensation. So we're actually about to start a study in September. One of my undergrad students, Piper, that I'm working with, is going to be exploring this among folks who are neurodivergent versus those who are neurotypical, to see are the experiences of mindfulness practice different, and what are the implications for this as a tool for improving sex. So that would be the only group that I would say we really don't know if this might show up differently among that population or not.
One of the questions that I got a few times from my audience when I told them I would be speaking with a mindfulness and sex expert, first of all, is it possible? And second, if so, how can I maybe use mindfulness or use any sort of tool to address sensory issues during sex? So sensory overload or sensations that a person might be particularly sensitive to.
That's an excellent question, and probably taps into some of what we're trying to understand when we apply mindfulness to neurodivergent folks, where the experiences of sensations might be different. And so, the question is, or the hypothesis is really, if we can guide a person to be with a sensation in the earliest moments of it, right? So as soon as you notice the onset of a particular sensation, and if we can really stay with it and experience it through the lens of vibration and intensity and heat and location and all these sort of sensory qualities in a very moment by moment way, does that alter the experience? I don't know. I think that's another empirical question that we haven't been able to answer yet. But if I were to take a step back and make a guess, I would guess that, because mindfulness teaches us to experience sensations as they are, not interpreted through a storyline, not through a filter, but as they are, could that alter the experience for a person who maybe experiences sensations in a different way? I don't know. I hope that someone studies this, and I think it would be a fascinating study to do that maybe brings together different experts from different disciplines, and then obviously people with lots of lived experience to be able to say, here's how it feels for me. And, do we need to make some modifications to how we deliver the mindfulness exercises?
I wonder even if a mindful presence could be helpful in recognizing these sensations before we get to overwhelm or before we get to sensory overload, and being able to make a decision before we kind of get to that point.
That was definitely the reasoning when we applied mindfulness to people with a history of trauma. And in fact, we did and published a research study where we recruited women who have sexual difficulties in the context of a history of sexualized violence, where most of them would say, the earliest, when I experience arousal, it's very triggering for me. I dissociate, I'm pulled into the negative experience that happened. And exactly as you've described, if we can introduce it to them very slowly, like toe in the water before we fully jump in, can that be a way to ease them in slowly, to make other adjustments, like maybe opening the eyes and stepping out of the mindfulness for a moment before being reintroduced? And indeed, that was what we found. So when we compared the mindfulness group to the cognitive behavioral therapy group, those individuals, women with a history of sexualized violence, reported much more mind-body synchrony during sexual arousal, which means the mind and the body were fully present, fully aligned, compared to the cognitive behavioral therapy group. And what they told us at the end was it allowed them to feel like arousal was safe again, because they could kind of ease back into arousal slowly.
What would be some misconceptions that people have either about sexual desire or using mindfulness in this context? What are some misunderstandings that you encounter in your work?
I mean, on the way of misconceptions in mindfulness, I think there's a belief that among some people that, is this a religious practice? You know, I'm an atheist, I don't want to do something, or I'm a Christian, I don't want to practice Buddhism. And again, in response to that, I provide the perspective that this belongs to everyone. This is a secular practice. This is not a religious practice. There's also a belief that, you know, if a person struggled with yoga, that they can't do mindfulness. And yoga is just as much body as it is mind. And it could be that the person really struggled with some of the kind of physical poses due to chronic pain or other issues, but that the mindfulness component is still, you know, a really important part of that. So definitely beliefs around that. There's also a belief that how could mindfulness possibly change the brain? Like, what do you mean it changes the brain? What do you mean it leads the brain, the different components of the brain to communicate differently with one another? Or it results in growth of neurons and dendrites in particular parts of the brain. And here's where the neuroimaging science and the kind of more basic neurological science has taught us, and neuroscience studies have taught us that the brain does change in function, in other words, in what it does in the moment, but also in structure after repeated mindfulness practice. So that's also a really important fact to dispel some of the myths that how on earth can breathing at a raisin possibly improve my life? And the answer is, you know, it does. It does. So those might be some myths and stereotypes particular to mindfulness. When it comes to myths and stereotypes around sex, there's a long list, you know, everything from planning sex makes it boring and clinical to if I don't have an orgasm, sex isn't pleasurable or there's something wrong with me, or if I lost my desire, I can't get it back, or sex ends with menopause or with a certain age, or if I'm single, I can't experience sexual health and sexual pleasure. There's so many myths that emerge from sexual activity. And part of the problem there is we don't have a universally implemented sex education system in our public education curriculum. The curriculum exists, it's just not universally implemented. And so a lot of people don't get any sex education, or they might take their sex education from pornography, or, you know, they hop onto Google and learn it in a kind of haphazard way. And so they're especially vulnerable to many sex-related myths and stereotypes that are perpetuated by television and media and songs and things like that. Yeah, again, mindfulness could potentially be a tool there, because if you have a particularly deep-seated belief about sex, mindfulness can be a way of helping you to be with that, loosen the grip on it, maybe examine it from a distance in a more objective way, and potentially challenge it and replace it with a much more accurate belief.
Just now you mentioned low desire experiences, and at the beginning we had touched on low desire being one of the most common sexual difficulties that all sorts of people face. So specifically, how can we apply mindfulness to that experience? So let's say somebody's listening and they're going, I don't initiate anymore, I've lost all interest. We're obviously differentiating between asexuality and somebody who's experiencing low desire that they'd like to change. How can we use a practice like mindfulness?
Yeah, so again, after the foundational practice, I often, in a bit of a didactic or educational way, like to introduce people to the sexual response cycle, which normalizes absence of desire prior to sexual activity. And it recognizes the importance of being very intentional around what are your reasons for engaging in sex. So inviting the person to really think about, you know, why engage in sex? And can I be totally open and accepting to the fact that I don't feel desire? Now, consent is still absolutely required, but we don't have to go into sexual encounters with any desire or high levels of desire, as long as we have a good reason, consent, willingness. And then mindfulness plays a role because it allows you to really tune into what the body does in the moment. So as you're receiving touch, either from your own hand or from a partner or other kinds of stimulation, Can you use mindfulness to really tune into and experience that just as it is? And what we know, what the sexual response cycle teaches us, is that as the body starts to respond, as it starts to elicit arousal, if we pay attention non-judgmentally, that paves the way for wanting. That paves the way for what we call responsive desire. And so very often what you'll have is desire emerging after the onset of a sexual encounter, not before. And if that continues and the person can, stay with it and be non-judgmental and continue to notice the sensations and the stimulation, then that gives way to a desire, a stronger desire that might culminate in satisfaction and pleasure and reward the sexual response cycle, so the person is motivated the next time as well. So we kind of layer on the skills of mindfulness in noticing what the body does, in being very present and patient with basic didactic information, which is desire is not an on and off switch. It's something like a slow burning fire that can be kindled. It can blow high, it can wax and wane, and it's not dependent on a person's age or relationship configuration or anything like that. So that's how kind of our understanding of sexual desire and the sexual response cycle intersects beautifully with the skills of mindfulness.
You're saying that desire is not necessarily a prerequisite to intimacy or pleasure or arousal, and that those things can come kind of snowball effect if we're using something like mindfulness to pay attention to pleasant sensations or whatever it is, closeness to your partner, or a touch that feels nice, or arousing playful interaction. There could be all sorts of different things that could then spark that desire next.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Beautifully put. That's exactly right. Well done.
So,
good summary.
Thank you. I'm just thinking, Professor gave me an A+. The last question that I'll ask you before we jump into the extended Patreon version, where I have a couple audience questions for you. In your work, in your research, what is one thing that you wish everybody knew?
I wish everyone knew that mindfulness was already in their back pocket, that they already have all the skills they need to be compassionate and be fully present. And it's just a matter of reaching into the pocket and pulling it out.
That is such a nice place to end this. Thank you so much for joining me. Is there anything that you'd like to promote, anywhere that people can find you, the things I can link in the show notes, in the description? Yeah,
for sure. So my research team, which is at UBCSHR, we really use that space to disseminate scientific information about sexual health to the general public. So that can be a fun way to kind of see what's new in sex research and why is this important. And then my own handle is at Dr. Lori Brotto, and that's where I share kind of adventures of what it's like, day in the life of being a sex researcher, sex therapist, conference travels, things I learn, things I think about and whatnot. And then my meditations I have freely available. Those are on my website, which is loribrotto.com. You can, download them and listen to them, save them to your devices. My 2018 book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness, is really a distillation of the science of mindfulness and sex, delivered in a way that's really accessible, that anyone can read. And then the workbook that was published in 2022 walks the reader through all the steps in, how do you build and establish a mindful sex practice. And along with that, you would listen to the downloadable meditation guides to kind of practice on your own.
So many great resources. I could personally vouch for both the book and the companion workbook. I think they're incredible work. So that will, again, all be linked in the description and show notes if you want to check out more. Thanks for listening. You can also access all of our extended cut episodes with bonus content from every single guest over on Patreon at patreon.com/AlaynaJoy. That's patreon.com/ALAYNAJoy. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at sleepingaroundpod for updates, teasers, episode discussions, and more. This episode was produced by Alayna Joy and Danae Fender and edited by Corey Mosquita. See you next time, back here on the couch.